Good morning. I'm Deanna from Pizan Academy, and welcome to Morning Coffee. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about teaching some of the classical works, and we focus quite a bit on the classical works, but when you're teaching these, it's really important that you put them into context. For instance, we teach the Illiad and the Odyssey for our 7th and 8th grade, and I also taught these when I taught college. And it's when you just hand a student a piece of work, particularly something so old, it's so important that you let them know the history and the culture that surrounds it. So, what's important is to provide that backstory. So, a lot of people for the Iliad and the Odyssey, they think that it's set in classical Greece, like the height of Greece when the Parthenon was flourishing and being built, and Athens was at its height, and that sort of rivalry between Sparta and Athens was going on. But it actually predates that quite a bit. And it dates back to the Mycenaean age, which is actually kind of pre-Greek. Now, they are an early Greek culture along with the Minoans and the Cycladic cultures. Minoans were a peaceful culture on the island of Crete, and the Cycladic culture lived on a circular island chain in the Aegean Sea. But the Mycenaeans came after them, and they were on mainland Greece, and they were a group of city-states, so to speak. Now, not the polis, or which is actually means city-state, that we think of in classical Greece, but they were a whole bunch of little kingdoms that made up the Mycenaeans. The Trojans were actually on what is now mainland Turkey, and so they had this great war, and so that's why in chapter 2 of the Iliad, when they're listing the ships and the armies, those are all the ships from the mainland or the islands of Greece across the sea that traveled to the Trojan War. Now, one thing with the Iliad is that when the student starts reading it, they're 9 years into the war. So Homer drops you in something that's already been going on for 9 years. And we know this as we read. And so it's really important that you set that context and explain that this is the Mycenaean period and show them a map of Mycenae and the different areas, and then also where Troy is. But also, the Greeks really thought this was their history. They believed that, they worshiped these same gods that are mentioned in the story, and they believed that this is their history. We know in the modern world that, Apollo wasn't going down and mucking around, and Poseidon didn't take sides and interact. You don't have Aphrodite sweeping Paris off the battlefield. We know that that's probably mythology. We're probably about 99.999% sure. But it's still interesting that the Greeks really believe this is their history. So if you're teaching these stories, it's so important to give the backstory. Now, Homer is the one that wrote them down, and we attribute him. Some scholars still debate that a little bit, but these stories were passed down by word of mouth. They were just kind of folklore like we have even in the modern world. I'm not sure how often we even teach things like George Washington and the apple tree, or Johnny Appleseed, Paul Bunyan and the blue ox. These were folklore, and they were handed down word of mouth, and Homer is the one that wrote those down. So we don't know how much is him and how much is tradition. He wrote in the Dark Ages, and Mycenae, they collapsed, the Mycenaean civilization, and then Greece returns to an agrarian society. So they leave the cities, they leave a sort of more cosmopolitan life, and they just go back to farming. It's very similar to what happens after the classical world falls, and we get into the medieval period or the European Dark Ages. And so what happens is the Mycenaeans had a writing. It's called Linear B is the name of the script. And that goes away in the Dark Ages, which is another reason why we call them dark, is that we believe that there was a period of illiteracy. And then the Phoenicians, a seafaring group just north of Greece, their alphabet is what the Greek alphabet is actually based on. So they totally didn't continue the Mycenaean writing, but they did continue some of the pottery and some of the other traditions, but it was just very dispersed and kind of a different period when this was written down. And so by teaching all of that, you're really going to enrich the stories, and you're going to help the student understand what's going on. So with that, I'm currently working on the Odyssey, and I'm going to head back to work. Have a great day.